Hey there, everybody. It's Crazy John Carrots, and I'm here again with Gennady Stolyarov the second, and we've interviewed him plenty of times. So he is the chairman of the Transhumanist Party, the United States Transhumanist Party. And tonight we said we'd do a follow up after the election. So kind of we're doing a follow up of how things are going and what both our thoughts are on how many days are we into it now? Do you know the exact count?
Well, the inauguration was on January 21st. We are recording this on March 21st, so we're 2 months in.
2 months in, yeah, and it has been an interesting ride so far. Uh, my initial thoughts were he was going to do a bunch of stuff, just to say he did a bunch of stuff in the first 100 days, and then it would probably slow down. And I think it seems to have slowed down a little bit. I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think it's slowed down a little.
Well, there has been quite an onslaught, and it does seem like the country is still working through the implications of the first wave of actions of the Trump administration, if one could call it that, because it has been more of a continuous set of activities on multiple fronts. And I think the difficulty is in keeping track of it all because it is so spread out. One could look at Doge, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. One could look at some of the activities being done with regard to, let's say, Trump's political opponents, with regard to mass deportations, with regard to foreign policy, with regard to trade wars, tariffs, some tariffs that are announced that are implemented and then withdrawn or delayed. And all of that creates a kind of overall nebulous impression. One isn't sure exactly what is happening or whether there's an overall design to it or whether it's more of a scattershot approach or an approach of throwing a bunch of things at the metaphorical wall and seeing what sticks. So, with that being said, I did not expect that pace of activity because I am more used to what happened during Trump's first term, where there was very early on a set of measures like the travel ban for visitors from multiple countries, but that got overturned very quickly, and the Trump administration's activities got blocked by the courts very quickly during the first term. And then the Trump administration took a more incremental approach. And so far, I'm not seeing the Trump administration taking that incremental approach. There have been some court orders, there have been some lawsuits, but it seems that a lot of these activities are proceeding apace, sometimes in defiance of the court orders or in ways that get around Congress altogether, even when Congress is supposed to be making certain decisions, like the decision of whether or not to allocate funding or to cut a particular agency. That is not an action that the president is able to do unilaterally.
So, what do you think so far? Well, okay, what do you think of Elon Musk with his DOGE and cutting things out, and the fact that some of the numbers they've come up with didn't seem to be actual numbers? Or let's not forget the transsexual mice. Uh,
Right. Which are actually transgenic mice. It has nothing to do with gender, but they just completely misunderstood it at a basic level. And my issue with Doge primarily is in regard to how haphazard, indiscriminate, and unintelligent it is. There is some waste at the federal level. The infamous $750 toilet seats on aircraft carriers were uncovered as early as the 1980s, and there has been similar wasteful spending. But the wasteful spending does not, in its vast majority, occur because of federal employee salaries. Federal employee salaries are around 3 to 4% of the federal budget. What is actually wasteful are some of the contracts to politically connected corporations, and those contracts are the ones that drive up the costs of a lot of the goods or services that the federal government is purchasing. But Doge isn't really focused on cutting or studying those contracts. Indeed, the way to really achieve government efficiency and to reduce wasteful functions would be to study each activity in detail, to try to gather data, to try to interview people who actually know what is happening and figure out which expenditures are worthwhile and which could be reduced or which could be replaced with something else. But if there are these massive headcount reductions that often make no distinction on the basis of what the employee in question actually does or what the individual employee's performance was. Sometimes they were made based on the probationary status of that employee. So recently hired or recently promoted employees were terminated. And sometimes there's a directive for an agency-wide reduction of force. So a particular agency could be instructed to cut X% of staff. That is not going to be helpful because often those numbers of staff are needed for the agency to perform its essential functions, the functions for which that agency was created. And if you cut the staff, what you're going to get is dysfunction. You're going to get inefficiency. You're going to get a situation where the government indeed is unable to deliver on whatever promises or whatever roles it was supposed to perform. And then the critics are going to come in and say, well, this agency is failing, but that wasn't necessarily a foregone conclusion. Perhaps the agency starts to fail because it doesn't have sufficient staff, it doesn't have sufficient resources. We spoke during our last interview of what often happens in those situations when there are not enough employees, then the gaps get plugged metaphorically using contractors, and contractors tend to be more expensive. Also, contract firms could have their own agendas, and as a result, maybe the job gets done, but it might not get done as well, and it gets done more expensively. So not having salaried employees could be costlier to an agency. And again, I see a great problem with the executive branch making these decisions unilaterally, bypassing Congress, because it is the job of Congress to decide which agencies should exist and should get funded. That's a legislative function. And the executive branch enforces the laws. The executive branch does not get to unilaterally legislate. And even in a situation where I would agree that something should be cut or something should be reformed, I would want that to be done through the proper channels to respect the separation of powers.
It was interesting, some of the things you said. I used to work for the federal government for a while. I'm retired from the state government, as you know. But I mean, I saw things where, people talk about the $700 toilet seat. And I saw an example in my office where actually the policy was written to help the small mom and pop store. We were not allowed to buy from, say, Sears. Sears is the exact example I want to use because we needed a heat gun. We were doing a chemical experiment. We had to heat up material that was similar to cat litter that grabbed the tritium and had to get it heated quick to release it. You need a heat gun. So the same heat gun we paid over $100 for, you could go to Sears and pay $29 for. But the way our stuff was written, we could not order or go down to a big store and buy it. We had to buy from a mom and pop store because we were supporting mom and pop America and their businesses. Now, what came into it is mom and pop were the ones really ripping off the government because they knew the government had to buy from them, and they quadrupled the price of the heat gun. And it was the exact same heat gun. And I looked at it, it was the exact same heat gun. And so, I realized that the program that the federal government had put into place was actually to try to help the mom pop, not hinder them. But then the mom pop took advantage of it. And I mean, they unbelievably took advantage of it. And it's like, I myself feel they probably thought, oh, it's the government money. But yeah, but that comes back around. I mean, that's what people sometimes don't realize. And sometimes contracts, like you said, contractors. I worked for the state in permitting, and we had grant programs that were funded by federal money. And some of the engineering firms, we would joke that we knew certain ones that were going to design the plants that they were building, and we joked that they would put in gold flagpoles and gold handrails. Now, they did overbuild, but what that got me, though, as an engineer and stuff, is the stuff they built worked because they did overbuild it. A lot of times you see where they nickel and dime things and then it doesn't work. So although realized they were taking advantage of the grant program, they were actually building a better quality product that some of the other people that were nickel and dime it didn't. So it's interesting how some of the programs they set up, the government isn't trying to abuse their money or waste their money. They're actually trying to help the small person, the small company. And it's sometimes the people trying to they think of the government as a gold mine, I mean, and that's sad to me too. But then the same people probably turn around and say how the government is wasteful. So I mean, it's a slippery slope. There's more than one side to everything, and that's the difficult part. Also, and like you said, programs. And the other thing I've seen a lot of times in government, you say, they might be understaffed to begin with. A lot of times I'll see somebody come in new, and we're in a new administration, and they have all these great new ideas, and they supposedly implement them. I'm going to say supposedly, and they are supposedly working really well, and they go off somewhere else. I mean, you can't go much higher than being the president of the United States, but in other companies and in government, they get promoted somewhere else and they leave. And then these programs don't work. Well, to be honest with you, the programs never worked. And then the people that had envisioned them in the first place, their excuse is the fact that, well, the people that are there now aren't properly implementing it. It's not the concept of my program, it's the people now aren't really implementing it. And I've seen so much of that, and that goes on a lot too, and that causes, I think, a lot of waste and a lot of issues in the government. But I'm just talking about things I've seen. I do think it's scary when people are getting laid off in large numbers, because I think it's a contradiction where you want people to have jobs by merit, and then I'm not sure that by merit qualifications is how you're getting rid of them. That's my concern there. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Right. I think that there is a significant element of this that follows the Project 2025 scheme, let's say, of trying to replace career civil servants with partisan loyalists. So this was written about in the Project 2025 master handbook, the so-called mandate for leadership, and the goal is essentially to create a civil service that is loyal to the administration in power more so than being an objective cadre of what the Project 2025 architects would call technocrats, but they don't like so-called technocrats because technocrats are not political, at least they don't have to be. And technocrats essentially function according to the logic of the position or the logic of the job or a certain technical skill set. And whether a Republican or a Democrat or somebody else is in power, they do roughly the same job. Of course, sometimes the legislature, Congress, or the president may have certain priorities, and government agencies do adjust through various layers of appointed officials. But the civil service is intended to be insulated from that. And Project 2025 seeks to undo that and seeks to essentially sweep away a vast number of positions that the architects of Project 2025 think might resist some sort of political push from the presidential administration. Now, what's also interesting is this approach of suddenly sweeping away vast numbers of people as well as significant government functions is not an approach that is endorsed even by some, let's say, staunch free market advocates. So one of my favorite thinkers is Ayn Rand, who very much was in favor of laissez-faire capitalism, free markets, and a reduced role for government and economic activity. But in 1962, she was asked essentially what changes would she institute if she were elected president tomorrow. And I'd like to read her response because I think it is highly informative of what a much more rational approach would look like. And these are her words, so I will say this is her perspective, but compare and contrast it with what Elon Musk and Doge are doing. So Ayn Rand was asked, if you were elected president of the United States tomorrow, what changes would you institute? And she responded, this is the last thing I'd attempt or advise anyone to try. But to the hypothetical question, what would I advocate if my advice were immediately put into effect? I'd answer, start decontrolling the economy as fast as rational economic considerations permit. I speak of rational economic considerations because today, every part of the population is dependent on government controls. Most professions have to function under controls, and their activities are calculated on that basis. So if anyone were to repeal all controls overnight by legislative fiat, that would be a disastrous, arbitrary, dictatorial action. What a free country needs is to give all the people concerned sufficient notice to readjust and reorganize their economic activities. Therefore, after working out with economists the kind of program necessary to decontrol the country and what controls should be repealed first, I would then advise passing legislation announcing that certain controls will be abolished within 3 years, say, the period calculated to allow people the opportunity to readjust their activities. In a free economy, no change happens out of the blue and overnight. Every economic change, every development is gradual. Therefore, in a free society, there are no immediate and disastrous changes. But given our present situation, any sudden changes could create disastrous dislocations, and so we should decontrol gradually. And I note she said this in 1962, so this was before even Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, before a lot of the agencies that were created under Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush. So all of this was premised on a federal government that at the time was much smaller and did a lot less than the federal government does today. But her main point is that when you have a system of controls and regulations in place, people begin to depend on them. Their activities, their economic calculations, their long-term plans have adjusted to them. And you don't want to shock them out of it because that will create a lot of disruption. So she's saying the goal for her is to decontrol all of that. And maybe if she looked at Elon Musk's activities today and the activities of Doge, she might agree with some of the end goals, but she would disagree with doing it so quickly. And she would disagree with doing it without a plan and without considering what should be repealed first. What is the proper sequence of actions? So I think that's a much more measured perspective. And of course, it requires a long-term time horizon that could extend for years and maybe decades. And perhaps what is happening is Donald Trump and Elon Musk don't think they have that long of a time period. They think they have a very short window in which to act. And if they don't act now, they won't get another chance, maybe because their opponents will rally and stop them somewhat, or they'll lose the midterm elections and they'll have a divided government starting in early 2027.
That's a good possibility, I think, because I think everybody's getting surprised. I have some thoughts on what you said. One thing is, talking about civil servants and stuff. It sounds to me like a return to the old days, and not even that long ago. I have to admit, probably have about close to 44 years of government experience, local and federal, and then my 35 with the state. But I've seen and I've had friends whose fathers worked for the government. And in the old days, they would purposely register as independent because they did not want to be on the books as being either Democrat or Republican because of what would happen when the governor would change, or another politician that had an effect on them would change, because it could come down to their jobs, that they could be cleaned out of their offices because of not being in the proper party. So to me, that kind of reminds me of like a go back to the old days. Not a plus, but a backward step in a way where people have to be worried about that. And the other thing I was thinking of too was a lot of times I've seen when they go through and they change a lot of programs or get rid of a lot of programs too quickly, a lot of times they make screw ups. I don't know what better way to put that there. And they realize, oh, we have to do something because now this isn't covered there, that isn't covered. And sometimes that spinning their wheels to recover, that's to recover their behinds, because there's things that new problems they've caused by getting rid of some of this stuff. And in the long run, sometimes that costs more money than what they saved in the first place. Although they can still go on the books as saying we did all these changes. Okay, you implemented that change, which cut this and this, but then you had to implement this and this to make up for the fact that you cut that and that. And really, how did that really save anything? A lot of times I would say smoke and mirrors. A lot of things can be smoke and mirrors that the government does, and they throw something out there and say this is great, while at the same time something else is happening. And I think Trump's like that. I think Trump and Elon are going to save money on this stuff, but then I think they're probably going to waste money somewhere else and make it sound like it's the best thing, you know.
Yes. I don't think they're going to have net savings because the fallout of all of these sudden cuts is going to be such that crises are going to be created. Elon did at least briefly fire air traffic controllers, people in charge of the nuclear weapons stockpile, people who were administering the US response to Ebola. And I think once this was discovered, Elon himself realized, oh, it wasn't a good idea to fire these people, but the chaos had already been created. So it was even the case that not all of these people got their jobs back right away after they were terminated and the mistakes were admitted, because the machinery of terminating them and dislodging them from their positions had already been set into motion. And one aspect of bureaucratic machinery is once you set it in motion, it's difficult to stop it. It's not like a switch that you can flip on or off. There are many moving parts to it. And so that inertia of the system, it could work to perpetuate the system, or it could work to disrupt the system. And once the disrupting mechanisms have been set in motion, they can't just be stopped because a high-ranking official wants them to stop. And that's something Elon doesn't realize yet. And maybe he will refine his approach to some extent, but one aspect of his personality is that he likes to shoot from the hip, metaphorically speaking, and he keeps doing it. So what is more likely is he will move on to other things, other areas in which he can shoot from the hip, and then maybe some other members of the administration will try to clean up the mess. There was already a fairly well publicized meeting between Trump, Musk, and the various cabinet secretaries, where many of the cabinet secretaries were expressing frustration at Elon, for instance, for cutting USAID, which is under the purview of the State Department. So Marco Rubio was upset with Elon Musk for essentially shutting down one of his agencies without really consulting or involving him.
Yeah, it is interesting. I feel like sometimes Trump is just going, oops, oops, I made a mistake. And he even said, oh, I'm going to make some mistakes, but we'll try to correct them as soon as possible. But what happens then is I think they diffuse it by saying, yeah, but we're trying to do something good here. We're trying to get rid of all this corruption. And did you realize how many 300-year-olds were getting Social Security? I mean, they deflect it that way. And then people are like, oh, yeah, he made a mistake. But they're trying to cut corruption. And I think the thing is that the people that are saying that's okay are the people that aren't being affected.
Right.
Or they don't realize they're being affected yet. The other aspect of when you work for the government, I know you work for the government, but when you deal with the public and you work for the government, they hate you. The public hates you until they need you. And when they need you, then they want you to do all sorts of amazing things for them while you're standing on your head and humming the national anthem, while who knows what else, saying the rosary at the same time or whatever. But when they need you, they love you until you don't do exactly what they want, and then they hate you again. And that's the issue too. So when they're taking pot shots at this corruption, a lot of people are like, oh well, government employees, they're lazy, they're this or that. All right, we both know there is some of that. There is some of that, but then you also have a lot of hard workers in the government also. I mean, my joke always is, if you work and you do good work, you get rewarded with more work. So you will sometimes have the slackers in government, like you do in any job, and that makes more work for the workers. But there is a lot of workers out there in the government, and there's a lot of people in government that take their jobs very seriously. I mean, there's some people I think that take their jobs more seriously than they should even, but I mean, there are people that do, and I think people don't always realize that because it's that love-hate thing people have with the government. I used to drive around in a federal vehicle when I worked for EPA, and you'd go out to check some of our equipment that was watching TMI because we were monitoring TMI, the radiation after the accident. And some of them were scared or would get their gun just because they saw a vehicle that said U.S. Federal EPA office on it and stuff. And it's like, but that's interesting to me too because farmers kind of complain about the government, but yet they get money from the government. And I've known farmers that told me how they purposely grew things to get money from both. Like they'd plant corn in between like cherry trees so they could get money like the next year if there's too much corn, not to plant corn, you know, and they would purposely do this banking on how much money they'd get from the government. So it's an interesting love-hate relationship that I think our citizens have with government employees. And I don't think they really appreciate you until they need you. And I don't think they really think you're worth it until they need you, because there's a lot of things that go on that people don't understand the usefulness of it. And that's another important thing. Does Elon understand all the reasons that these things came into effect? Why is that there? Why are there people that are supposed to be doing that? And like you said, I don't know if you exactly said that, but I mean, I don't know if he put enough evaluation into it to really understand the intricate workings to know what he's destroying and why it was there in the first place.
Right. He's certainly no economic scholar and no scholar of political science. He might see a few things that outrage and upset him, and he thinks he has the ability to affect the situation because he has wealth, he has political influence now, he has people who are able to do his bidding, but he doesn't study the long-term history or implications of the work of a particular government agency. And again, if there were a serious concerted effort to study what a particular agency does, what the programs actually are, what the effects are, whether that's necessary, what the cost benefit analysis is, I think that would be reasonable to undertake. But it would take years to do a thorough job. And I think Elon doesn't want it to take years. I think he wants it to take days. And this is where he's running up against resistance even from within the Trump administration. I do believe this approach is unsustainable because ultimately you can only go so far and antagonize so many people before there's a critical mass of people who say, this is enough. We are not going to accept this anymore. And the fact that so many of the employees that are being terminated right now are Republicans, or at least they would have been fairly neutral toward the Trump administration. They would have been willing to do jobs that, even though they themselves would have been neutral from a political standpoint, could have helped to bolster this administration because they would have kept things running in the background, thus creating fewer problems for the administration to deal with. Now these people have been alienated, and these people have been mobilized to some extent, because if one suffers some serious blow from a financial standpoint or even from a morale standpoint, and a morale blow is certainly likely to somebody who has been fired arbitrarily, they're going to notice this and they're going to try to do something about it. At the very least, they're going to vote in a different way. So I think Trump and Musk are creating their own opposition, even though at the start of Trump's second term, the so-called resistance was a lot lower key than it was during the start of the first term. And I think maybe they were emboldened by this. They thought, oh, this is our cue to enact a very sweeping series of changes. But in so doing, they are creating a new resistance, which I think may be stronger. And unfortunately, I think this resistance may be less civil than the first resistance, because we're already seeing acts of vandalism and sabotage, Tesla vehicles being set on fire or spray painted with graffiti. We didn't really see that the first time around. We saw some mass protests when the first Trump administration came into office. The vast majority of those protests were peaceful. People were wearing pink hats, holding up placards, and so forth. And I think that is a very legitimate form of resistance. But as you know, John, I take great exception to any violent actions, whether they be on the left or on the right. So I oppose the urban riots of 2020. I oppose the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And I'm opposed to these acts of vandalism and destruction against Tesla vehicles. I think many Tesla owners are not themselves political and they didn't purchase those vehicles because they approve of Elon Musk's politics, but they're being caught up in this frenzy of reaction to what Elon Musk is doing. And unfortunately, the only effect this is having is to radicalize and antagonize people on both sides of the current partisan divide. So that's very unfortunate. And I hope that some efforts to moderate and de escalate are going to be undertaken soon.
Well, I had a couple of things I was thinking, but one I'll throw out there first is it was interesting to me after one of the layoffs, somebody said something I'd read about him, Elon, saying that some of these positions could be handled with AI responses and stuff. And then I saw somebody say, now this is something close to the transhumanists. Somebody said something about, oh, maybe that'll actually bring the singularity upon us quicker. And I thought, well, that was an interesting twist there. You know, that something that seems so crazy could bring something else about. I don't know what your thoughts are on that comment that I had read, but
So, of course, the Transhumanist Party has taken a strong interest in the applications of AI, and we have used emerging AI systems ourselves, for instance, in creating art, music, even certain segments of our virtual enlightenment salons where we have AI podcast hosts. And I myself have used various AI chat platforms, including ChatGPT, several generations of it, or Grok, Grok 2, Grok 3. And I think there are many applications where these AI systems could help people, but they only go so far. They can, for instance, answer questions using publicly available research or generally known information, but it's more difficult for an AI to understand the full context of an individual's situation because the AI relies on information that's broadly available to everyone, as well as perhaps the prompt that somebody puts in, which could have some information, but not the whole context of a person's life or the history of that person's work. So you could have AI chatbots or virtual assistants, AI avatars that guide people in certain directions, at least in terms of initial interactions. They could ask the first line of questions, they could provide some general information, and maybe even certain documents could be fed into those AIs and they could analyze them and give answers based on those documents. And these could be the documents that have been developed or published by that agency. What those AIs still cannot do is make the executive decisions with an understanding of a subject matter expert. And indeed, these AI large language models are prone to what are called hallucinations. Sometimes they seek to appear authoritative in all circumstances, but there are genuine gaps in their knowledge or what the available research shows, so they make things up. And I've seen these systems make up sources or conjure facts out of essentially correlations with existing information, but those are not real facts. They're just plausible seeming.
so
And
you're
it
telling
takes
me that Trump is actually a faulty AI. Is that what
ha
sorry, I had to,
that's a good one.
but yeah, I myself do use some AI. I use AI a lot for correcting stuff that I do. Uh or when you want something reworded that you don't quite like the way it's worded. But I find as far as coming up with ideas, the ideas and the direction, you need a human for that.
Right.
And with my music, some of it I don't like my voice, and I will alter my voice. Give the computer an idea, and it'll smooth it out and make it sound different, which is interesting to me because I find my songs that actually use my voice, which I think is horrible. Sometimes people seem to listen to more than the smoothed out computerized ones. But I think it's sometimes I think there's a pushback though too.
Yes, and I think that there remains a very strong role for humans in both creative and analytical functions. So an AI can be a powerful tool, and I think the most powerful outputs are going to be in cases where AIs and humans collaborate. And the AIs could also be creative in certain respects. They could recombine the inputs that they receive in ways that a human wouldn't think of. And they could point to intriguing new possibilities. But it does take a human to curate this material, to distinguish what is worthwhile from what might not be as valuable or what could be just something very ordinary that has been rehashed. Over the years, and it has only been a few years, but I've had enough exposure to be able to do this, I have learned to distinguish output that is written by a human from output that is written by an AI. Actually, I think the AI output adheres too rigidly to structures that people are commonly taught in their English classes. Like if you write an essay, write it with 5 paragraphs or so. And in the first paragraph, tell us what you're going to say. And in the last paragraph, tell us what you just said. But human communication is more fluid and flexible than that. And generally speaking, some of the answers that one gets when asking an AI system can become too repetitive because it does very often just keep summarizing what it just told you. And I think the systems are designed to view this as being thorough or being formal. But when humans say something, generally they'll say the substance once. And if they re-emphasize it, they'll re-emphasize it in the context of having said something else, introducing another thought. So the AI outputs, at least in writing, in nonfiction analytical writing, tend to be overly formulaic, in my view. Now, with art, it's a bit different. I actually see the creative side of AI generated art to be more interesting than the technical side. Because, for example, an AI system today, whether that be Dolly or Grok or Flux or Midjourney, could create very interesting landscapes or cloudscapes. And it's getting better with cityscapes as well, or interiors, but with man-made objects, it seems that these AI systems, because of the way they generate their images, could have strange asymmetries or elements that just don't make sense from a functional standpoint. Like no human architect would have put this in a building. No human architect would have designed a lopsided window or a window that's fuzzy in one corner. But that's because of the way these images are generated. They're generated based on correlations. So if you have a rock that's jutting out in a slightly different place, that doesn't look odd because natural landscapes are like that all the time. There are processes that are essentially random that lead to these outcomes. Whereas man-made structures are designed intentionally with a purpose in mind, and a human artist depicting them would understand that, whereas an AI system draws upon vast numbers of images within its source database and correlations among them, and it varies them a bit to make really new and different and distinctive images. So those images may have some interesting and very innovative elements in them, like the background behind me right now. But they may also have elements that just don't seem to have a purpose or a rationale to them, or seem to have some strange design aspects that no human would have ever put into them. Now, you mentioned the singularity, the technological singularity, and that would require the arrival of what's called artificial general intelligence. So systems that are able to cross various domains and learn autonomously within those domains. So an AGI, for instance, that started out playing chess would be able to learn how to drive an autonomous vehicle or do some entirely different activity from the one for which it was programmed. The current systems cannot do that. They're narrow AIs, so they're programmed within specific domains, and they could become very good at them, like creating images or writing text, but they're not going to spontaneously teach themselves to do something completely different. And there are many thinkers who are experts in AI who consider the large language model architecture to be inherently incapable of reaching AGI. That's just not something that is part of the potential for these models. So my inclination is to think that true AGI is still about 20 years away. I think Ray Kurzweil's date of 2045 is still a plausible time frame for the arrival of AGI. But right now, we are not close to that. And as a result, I think companies that are cutting large numbers of human workers, or government agencies that are doing the same and thinking that AI will just replace those roles, are deeply mistaken, because the AI systems still require humans to use them and apply judgment to them. And what I'm seeing throughout the economy, from manual labor jobs to the so-called white-collar professions, is a shortage of human workers. There are certain positions that could be very productive if you even had one person in them using AI, but for whatever reason, there is such a cost-cutting and headcount-cutting mentality that those positions get eliminated or they don't get filled. And as a result, very little gets done. And it doesn't matter what tools are out there if nobody is using those tools, or if you don't have somebody at the front desk willing or able to receive somebody who walks in or interact with them, or if you don't have somebody in a customer support role willing to answer questions past a certain point, you don't deliver the service. It's as simple as that. No matter how much AI there is, you still need some level of human staffing to deliver those services.
Yeah, I totally agree with that at the point we're at right now, and I like what you said about the writing and stuff. I do like it to correct my writing. I think because of the fact you said that it makes it more formal. I have a habit of not only talking in run-ons but writing in run-ons. I mean, it's horrible. I got to go back and well, that could be at least 3 or 4 sentences. That one sentence I just did, but I think that's a habit, and I do my music videos with AI, and I love that you're not sure what it's going to do. I mean, I give it parameters of what I want, and sometimes it takes me maybe 5 tries with a video to kind of like what it did. Sometimes it'll do some really odd things. Like if you ever see my one on the Cedar Street Blues, that's actually about my parents' house, and they had one time had up to 24 cats, and they had a pool, and we used to watch TV and eat pizza. So there's pizza in it, there's TVs in it, there's cats in it, there's pools, but sometimes the kids are turning into cats, the cats are turning into kids. The pool is outside the house, and then it's inside the house. The cats are walking on water. The picture frames turn into TVs. The tables turn into TVs and turn it back into tables. And a pizza turns into a table. And it's kind of very like you felt like you fed the computer LSD. You know, it's a very interesting factor that I think it's definitely not thinking in the box because it doesn't know what a box is sometimes. And I think that's the interesting part of, like you say, the artwork, things that we don't think of. But then I'll admit, I set the parameters for it. So I can tweak the parameters if I want, but sometimes I like leaving them kind of open just to see where it runs with it. And that is kind of interesting. Uh, you know,
Yes. Sometimes I've given the AIs very broad and flexible prompts that were intended to test just one particular thing, whether it would comply with one particular aspect of its output. For instance, I gave Dolly 3 the prompt to generate a landscape without politicians. So literally, any landscape that didn't have a politician in it would have complied with that prompt. And Dolly 3 passed that particular test. It did not put any politicians in those landscapes. And the reason why I was asking it to do that was to test whether it understood negation. Because sometimes, especially early on, these systems would just focus on the presence of a term. And if you said, don't do X, the fact that X was present was interpreted by the system as actually a request to put X in there. So the earlier systems didn't really understand negation very well, but they have been improved to the point where you could tell them, create a landscape without politicians or without apple trees, and they would create something that complied with that constraint.
Now, something you made me think about, though, when you said about how they can't deviate real good is I've had some frustrating conversations with IRS employees. And during the IRS season, the tax season, they hire people because of the increased calls and stuff. And these people cannot think out of the box. They follow their programmed speech and questions. They could be replaced with an AI. Because to be honest with you, they do not vary out of their pre-done what they're supposed to say. And if you ask them something else, they have to go back to their pre-done thing because that's, and I think it's two things. They're told to do that. And the other thing is, I think a lot of them don't really understand their job to begin with because they don't have to. They just have to ask you those questions. They could be replaced. I mean,
Yes.
I actually think AI would probably do a better job than some of them have done. But so that kind of, I'm kind of interested in that. And, I thought it was interesting. You said I had to bring that up about the singularity. I didn't really think that was true either. But people go off about things sometimes. And I've loved the stories too, where they say that Elon Musk's satellites are the beginning of Terminator,
Yes, I think there is a lot of hype when a new technology gets released, and often the reality is more incremental and more mundane. But I agree with you. A human that only follows a script could be replaced by an AI, and the AI could provide a more interesting user experience because,
friendlier too.
yes, the AI could actually have more variation in how it responds. It could create a smoother response that acknowledges what the person is actually saying, but tries to steer the person toward the subject of conversation or what the AI is capable of doing. Like if a person seeks customer service, but for whatever reason types in, well, what do you think of the weather today? the AI system could actually say, well, I think the weather is nice or it's overcast or whatever based on the information it has access to, but then it could transition and say, well, on such a nice day or on such a gloomy day, what can I do to help you with X, your problem, whatever the situation may be. So there's more of an ability to do that for an AI system than for a human who is instructed to follow a rigid script. I think in some of those customer service positions, which aren't paid very well, by the way, people are just given scripts and they're given productivity targets. So you need to complete X number of calls every hour. And if you don't, then you're penalized for it. And there are some common issues. Here are some scripts to deal with those. And oh, you're not allowed to deviate from those scripts. That's above your pay grade. If somebody has a really challenging issue, you escalate it up to the manager. And in those cases, yes, that's frustrating to deal with because in the position of a customer, I would rather talk to somebody who knows how to address my particular issue right away. So somebody who would respond intelligently to what I actually said or typed in.
It's interesting about the script. I was just thinking, I'll get right back around in a second, but I'll just say this. I just sold one of our houses, and bought a condo in New Jersey by the beach. And I had Earthlink for internet, and I had Earthlink Unlimited. Well, every month they complained that I was going over my quota for data. And when you go over your quota, you get slowed down. Okay. I thought that was the idea. You were still allowed to use it. Well, after 10 months, they fired me. I feel they fired me. And the reason was because I was using too much data on my unlimited plan. And I'm like, hold a second. How do you use too much data on your unlimited plan? How can you call it an unlimited plan and then say I'm using too much data? But when I called up the woman, because it was funny, because they turned me off right after they actually had taken one of my payments. Yeah, you know how that goes. But when I got the woman, it was, of course, in a call center somewhere. And sometimes I feel bad for these people because you talk to them and you're pissed off. But they can only work within their script, offer you this, offer you that, tell you there's nothing they can do because it's always already been done and they have no power to do anything. And they don't. But they actually take the bunt, the most of your frustration, and there's nothing they can do. I mean, you might as well be talking to a system anyhow, because, but to me, it was just ridiculous in this day and age. I was using too much data on my unlimited plan.
Right.
Okay.
And the person who made that decision is probably in the C-suite somewhere, not directly handling consumer complaints, earning a much more sizable salary and making these decisions completely disconnected from either the experience of the customers or the experience of the people who receive those complaints. Moreover, the people on the front lines receiving those complaints can't readily communicate that information up the chain of command because let's say they're 5 or 6 layers removed from those executives. They can't just come up and talk to the executives directly and say, well, look, consumers are complaining about this. They would be fired for being impertinent. So they may be able to communicate to their immediate bosses, but each layer of middle management has the incentive to kind of embellish the picture or not communicate details that would frustrate their superiors. So the people in the C-suite are really insulated from what is happening on the ground, and they may encourage either explicitly or implicitly their subordinates to only give them good news or to give them a picture of the world that confirms their preconceived notions or validates their brilliant ideas for how to change company processes.
It's interesting you were saying that. I was thinking about that, that 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Uh, Now, just to let you know, I've met Kevin Bacon. So through you knowing me, you're already within 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon. But I feel that those people in that talk room, them nor their bosses, are nowhere even within 7 degrees of any of those people that really make the decisions. They're out there in this call center, and this is their job to do, and they get paid to do it. And I have to tell you though, I went to T-Mobile, and I'm not trying to advertise for either one. I liked Earthlink because I was with them when they first started under Sky Dayton. He was quite a visionary in his time too, and he's still out there. When he started that company years ago, so I was happy to be back with Earthlink. But now I'm with T-Mobile. I'm using the same data, and you know what? They don't complain. Difference with Earthlink was that it was 5G, and I think they were buying their 5G like off of Verizon. And what I find is, I think when you are like the bastard stepchild, meaning that you're not getting your internet directly from the company that's actually supplying it, I think they treat you like the bastard stepchild. Uh, like my phone's a Verizon. My sister gets Verizon through Walmart. Now she's still using the Verizon lines and stuff, but she doesn't get as good a service or as good a reply on things because she's removed. So I really wonder, although I'm perturbed at Earthlink, I actually think it's probably Verizon complaining, because Earthlink was probably getting their 5G most definitely from Verizon. And Verizon's like, we don't want to keep giving you this for that, because it's more than we want to give you. And but if it says it's unlimited, it should be unlimited. But let's get back to politics. Sorry about that. So, what do you feel? Where do you think we're heading right now? I'll throw out there some of what I hear from you is, I guess this is my interpretation is, and my thinking too, on kind of mixing it together. I think right now he's trying to do a whole bunch of stuff and get stuff done. I think there is a excitement to it and a rush, because I think they might know that eventually they're going to get slowed down, and that's kind of what I think is going to happen. I think there's going to be the oil's going to start getting thick and gooey, and the gears aren't going to be flowing like they'd like them to be, and people are going to be throwing up more blockades to them. And I think they're going to be getting slowed down in things they're doing. I don't know. I think that's what you're thinking also. Is that what you're
Yes.
thinking?
Yes, I think this blitzkrieg effort, if one could call it that, on the part of the Trump administration is going to get bogged down, and there are already signs that this is going to happen. Various court rulings that block certain aspects of Doge, for example, or resistance within the cabinet agencies themselves, resistance from Congress, because even a Republican dominated Congress is going to want to have more of a role and to be consulted to a greater extent than has happened. And finally, resistance from the public. There are, of course, the ideological opponents of Trump and Musk, who are already becoming quite a bit more vocal. But then there are, as I mentioned, all of the people whom these policies are going to adversely affect. And this doesn't just include the government employees who are laid off or people who can't get these government services now. This also includes all the people who are frustrated by tariffs. If tariffs start to raise the cost of living, then that is going to have an effect on public opinion. During our last interview, I commented on the reasons why, in my view, Trump won. Trump won because of prevailing frustrations with the high cost of living and the attribution of that situation to the mistakes of the Biden administration. Whether or not the Biden administration could have actually done something differently to prevent the rise of costs of living is not as important as the political perception that was cultivated and that Trump was able to successfully engender in the minds of many people, which was that life was better under Trump up to 2019, at least, than it was under Biden. And so Trump was able to say, well, if you elect me, you can get back to that standard of living and that level of costs of living. And I think increasingly people are going to realize this is not going to happen because the tariffs are only going to raise the costs of living. Trump has done nothing to fundamentally alleviate the inflationary pressures within the economy. So over time, there's going to be resistance from every segment of society. And in part, that's accelerated by this very haphazard approach and this very rushed approach that Trump and Musk are undertaking. So Trump and Musk may be thinking they have to pursue this rushed approach to fit everything in before the resistance materializes. But what this actually has the effect of doing is making the resistance materialize more quickly than it would have otherwise. If Trump had kept a lower key presence and done some fundamental reforms, but done them slowly behind the scenes, they might not have even been noticed by the media or by the general public. But as things stand now, every single day, so many egregious things are being noticed that I don't see this continuing for many more months. I would say perhaps during the first 100 days, this kind of momentum could continue to some extent. But after that, so about 40 days from now or so, it will slow down significantly.
Well, what I see happening is, people, I saw somebody made comment online the other day, oh, you people should shut up about the price of eggs. Do you realize how much corruption and waste he's cleaning up? Look at this great job he's doing. And I thought, exactly, that's the diversion and the deflection is he's not helping with the prices, bringing the food down. It's going up, but he's deflecting it and diverting the attention by saying, oh, but I'm cleaning up all this corruption. Once we get all this corruption cleaned up, you're going to see how all this is so much better. And it's still because of Biden. So that's what I see. I see them doing you know, don't watch what the one hand's doing because the other hand's doing something else. But the sad thing is people are seeming to fall for it. But like you said, which I think is a good example, some of the people they're firing and stuff might have been supporters that
Right.
were in the government, and that's going to make or family members of, and that can make more trouble for them. Because somebody made the point one time. I was on. We talked about that before. I still go on that program. I can't think what it is right now. Where they have the chats and stuff. And somebody said, "Well, whose government been better under, Republican or Democrats, as far as a quality of life?" And the guy said, "Well, that's not really what we should look at here." He says, "Actually, usually it's been the Democrats it's been better on, and the Republicans, other things have been better on traditionally in the past." But he made the point that Trump really is not a Republican. He's out there doing his own thing. And what we've talked about before is earlier in the conversation I was having upstairs, somebody said Democrats and Republicans. I said, yeah, but the Republicans aren't what you think of as Republicans anymore, and the Democrats aren't what you think of Democrats anymore. It's become an interesting world, and we talked about this before. Uh, I do think they need more third parties, and they need to realize that the people at the top with the governments have kind of been getting into their own world, and I think they've been losing touch. And that's what they liked about Trump is he seemed to have that, what's that old thing, kick butt and take names later kind of attitude that I think the average person kind of thought, oh, this is great. He's going to go in and, because I think that they have lost their touch with the common person. And some of the stuff he said, I think resonated with them. But, and I think some of it still does because they think, oh, now he actually really is cleaning up the swamp, And when he talked about the trade, the person that signed those last trade agreements really didn't know what he was doing. He was the one that signed those trade agreements, but he doesn't bring that up. It's interesting, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting and sad how the people still will make excuses for him, and I hope people pay attention more and start to. I think if food and everything really does start increasing, I think that's gonna move the people. Uh, you know, if some of these people right now that are getting fired whine and go on and talk about it, I think some people are gonna say, "Oh, well, they're just spoiled, elitist government employees. They probably have pension in multiple houses, and you know, they're gonna make up things where they don't want to listen to those people." But I think when they're hit themselves with the cost of food and products, that'll make a difference. And last time when he tried to do that, there were some companies that went out of business because he did tariffs before some of them, because companies within this country couldn't get the products they needed to make their product. So they were screwed. You know, I mean, you got to think about that too, is there are things that we're not totally self-reliant in this country. A company might need something from another country. And if you're making all these tariffs, then that might cost them out of being able to be profitable in their own business and go out of business themselves. And I don't think that's always being thought of. Like years ago, Reagan did the tariffs for Harley Davidson. Okay, I don't know if that was early 80s. I don't remember when you were born. That's probably before you were born. But it was made that any motorcycle over 700 cc's in size was going to get tariffed a lot. So what the Japanese started doing was making motorcycles 700, not 750s anymore, but 700s. And they started making more of their big bikes in this country. So it did have, which were probably more meaning they assembled them in this country, but it did make some jobs and some plants for Americans. And it did help Harley because then people were more willing to buy the bigger Harleys because the prices were more competitive with the Japanese bikes who were undercutting them. But now countries, the Europeans, the European Union is taxing things like Harley Davidsons and making it hard for Harley, who's just hanging on as it is. And some of their, you know, they've moved into doing European and other countries sales to help them, and they have a plant in India and one in Mexico too. And it's funny to me because Reagan tried to help them, but now these tariffs and countersuit are going to hurt a company that tariffs were made years ago to try and help. Mm-hmm. And it's just, I think we've talked about this before too. I don't think people study history as much as they should.
Yes, and history shows very clearly that tariffs do not work even in terms of their stated intentions of protecting domestic production for several reasons. First of all, domestic production often requires or relies upon foreign inputs, like manufacturers of cars in the United States may import materials or components. And if one puts tariffs on steel, well, that makes a key component of cars, tools, construction materials more expensive. And then if American consumers pay more because of the tariffs, of course they do, they have less purchasing power even to buy American-made goods. And then, as you mentioned, there will be the retaliatory tariffs that other countries will impose on American goods, making them more expensive. And as a result, even importers will be hurt by tariffs. So economists have recognized for over 2 centuries now that this kind of protectionist policy is counterproductive, and they preferred free trade, the liberalization of these kinds of restrictions, the removal of tariffs, even unilateral removal of tariffs. Their was a famous episode in mid 19th century British history where there was a campaign against the Corn Laws, which were import taxes on grain that actually made food prohibitively expensive to a lot of people in England and in Ireland as well. So Richard Cobden and John Bright organized the Anti-Corn Law League to ultimately lead to the unilateral repeal of these corn laws, which greatly helped the British economy and also then contributed to the arrival of an era of free trade where other countries began to lower or eliminate their tariffs as well. So, unfortunately, a lot of that is being undone now by the Trump administration, either because they use tariffs or the threat of tariffs as a kind of negotiating tactic, or they may genuinely believe that this is going to protect certain domestic industries, but in reality, it's going to have the opposite effect for a lot of industries and a lot of consumers, and other countries are going to follow suit. They, I think, are going to harm their own citizens with retaliatory tariffs as well. But once this vicious dynamic is unleashed, it's difficult to rein it back in unless there is a massive enlightenment that occurs among all of the countries involved and all of the key players.
This is interesting too. I have to laugh. I know. I think about the Boston Tea Party, about the taxation on tea, and I mean, didn't we learn that people revolt against that stuff eventually? But it's interesting to me. Just a quick side, and I'll get to wrapping this up. Then is today I still notice in Pennsylvania, tea is not taxed, and it's interesting to me that if you have a drink that's tea, it's not taxed. If you make it a tea and like a fruit drink mix, then it's taxed because it's no longer just tea. But they still don't tax tea here in Pennsylvania. And I thought, well, that's kind of funny because that's a holdover from the old days. That's still in the book somewhere, and they don't tax it. And it's kind of funny. You know, you could have a drink that's tea and like some other juice added to it, like half a juice that gets taxed. With the pure, just the tea doesn't get taxed. And it's kind of interesting how they still hold to that because of that going on back in the days. And a lot of people probably don't even realize that. And it is kind of funny sometimes how some of these things stick around in the books and how they still happen. But you think we'd learn years ago that people don't like when you start doing that. But people don't pay enough attention to the past. Like I said, to history.
Right.
They're just going to keep doing it and think they have some great new idea. I have to admit that is one plus to probably AI and stuff. I think as long as they have access to data, I think their ability to go back and analyze and different things. And I notice myself too with writing and having AI correct some stuff I write. Sometimes it'll surprise me and it'll refer back to something else I wrote. And it's like, oh, it remembered. You know what I mean? It was kind of interesting how it remembered something that I had written before and pulled it back up to me. And it's like, oh, that is kind of interesting. But I think that in that way, it could be better. But then again, the old saying of garbage in, garbage out. If man hasn't kept up to date or has gone back in and altered it themselves, like they say, history belongs to the victor. You know, they will change. People might change things. So I don't know. So okay, we've talked for a while here, and I don't want to keep you too long. So in closing, what do you think we're at, and when would you like to get back together and see how things have happened? You mentioned 40 days, you think. So maybe we should get back together at the end of that and see how things are going.
Yes.
What message might you want in closing up today and thinking of where we're at right now? It's an interesting world. It's definitely not how I expect it to be going right now. I mean,
Indeed.
some things I think are interesting. Uh, I was not always sure about the excessive woke pushes and stuff, and I know he's fighting back against that. And there was something. Oh, making English the American language. I kind of like that, and I'll tell you why. I'm originally from Allentown. Well, I'm from Bethlehem and Allentown, the Lehigh Valley. It's called considered. And when I lived there, uh, we had a large Middle Eastern subculture. But after I left, it got very Hispanic. Now, my grandfather was from Spain, but it's gotten very Hispanic. And there was a time when there was a push to try and make the language, the official language of Allentown, Spanish, and make the signs dual language. And their big support of that was that the country really had no official language. And so knowing that I've seen that happen in the past, and mind you, that could have been 20, 25 years ago already that happened. It's interesting to me to now finally make English the official language, because then people can't try and do that. And I think other countries have official languages and stuff. Some of them I know England has more sub languages than people realize. You know, like the Welsh, and you have some languages, some dialects over in Ireland and stuff. And for us being this country, thinking, you know, we came from the British and they speak English, we speak English. Ah, there is some more diversity over there than I think this country has anymore. And I do remember traveling through this country, cross country in '81, and seeing a lot of diversity in English across this country here, that I think now that people have started with cable and then satellite and internet and all the things today, I think the world, the world and our country is becoming more homogeneous because of that. But still, I think there's some diversity in other countries. And like I said, him making America English the main language, I kind of like that, just because I went through a city I came from where they were trying to change the language, you know, because there was no official language. So to me, that was kind of interesting. But I'm off on a tangent. But so that was one thing he did that was interesting. That making the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. I don't know. Uh,
Well, I think a lot of those changes are kind of cosmetic or symbolic in the sense that he's trying to, let's say, illustrate a particular point or get an easy accomplishment from the standpoint of his base. So renaming something could please his supporters within his political base who thought that maybe the original name or the previous name was too woke or not patriotic enough. But in terms of substantive impacts, I'm less worried about that. I'm more worried about how real people are going to be affected by some of these policies. And in terms of what I foresee, as I mentioned, I think some of the most egregious and fastest moving pieces are going to be bogged down within about 40 days' time. But I also see this as an era with a lot of chaos and a lot of division that is just going to be accentuated and exacerbated. I think the American people fundamentally are tired of the division and the political chaos, and they would prefer what they would consider normalcy and stability, being able to pursue their everyday lives in peace, focus on material well-being, focus on essentially the aspects of life that are close to them. And increasingly, frustration with the two-party system will grow. I think the escalating polarization is a way in which the power elite can perpetuate this divide and rule tactic. And I think it's well known that members of the power elite on both the left and the right are actually closer to one another than their rhetoric may suggest. Even Trump himself was at one point friends with Bill and Hillary Clinton. I doubt they're friends now, but they used to be seen at the same social gatherings, and it seemed they were fairly friendly with each other. So they're all part of the same social circle. They're all part of a group of about 10,000, give or take, prominent figures within politics, media, academia, big business, think tanks, consulting firms that are all interconnected. They communicate predominantly with one another. And what they're most afraid of would be the people being tired of them as a class, of the entire system that they're overseeing. And so to prevent that, they're setting people against one another. They are inciting these intense hatreds along these partisan lines. And they are intentionally trying to get people to segregate themselves into political tribes and to be outraged at only what the left is doing or only what the right is doing, when really people should be outraged at those divide and rule tactics, what that entire ruling elite is perpetrating. I think that there was a real possibility before Trump got elected, and particularly before the pandemic, that most people would just tune out this partisan politics. Most people would just decide all of this back and forth between the Republicans and the Democrats, it's not substantive. We want to focus on living our lives. We want to focus on what could actually help, which could be technological advancements, it could be cultural creation, say using the tools that the internet offers. It could be just through connecting with other people in day-to-day life and figuring out that our similarities as human beings and our fundamental shared goals and shared values actually overshadow our differences. But I think the ruling elite has done a very effective job in keeping people divided. And the more people start tuning out partisan politics, the more intense this division becomes in an effort to get people back into the fray, because that's now the favorite tactic of the ruling elite to maintain its power. And this is where parties like the Transhumanist Party offer a real meaningful difference, because we do not endorse those divide and rule tactics. We actually want to solve problems. We actually have a constructive view of what the future should look like, and policies that harness the power of technology to actually transform people's lives for the better, to resolve controversies, to try to figure out solutions that work for as many people as possible and are consistent with their values and goals, what they see as good outcomes. Because I see a path forward where all of humanity could benefit, whether one is conventionally right-wing or left-wing or neither of the above. People could experience better lives, longer lives, healthier lives, more productive lives, lives with less strife and tension and conflict. So that's the kind of future we should be aspiring toward. And I would urge everyone viewing this to think about ways to transcend that political dichotomy, to not fall prey to the divide and rule tactics, and instead join us at transhumanist-party.org/membership. Membership is free, and take part in our conversations, take part in our efforts to advance policies that will actually benefit as many people as possible.
Well, thank you for being with us. I won't get on any tangents at the end here. I agree with everything you said, and I'm glad to have you with us again for your insightfulness and your well thought out views on everything, and I agree, and we need to work together. And like I said before, the smoke and mirrors kind of thing helps them. Like I liked your divide and rule kind of idea, and I think that's kind of it. But I think we try to aim for getting back together in 40 days and see how things are going.
Yes,
And
indeed.
the only thing I will say in ending is so far, this has not gone the way I thought it would. And, you know, there could be something else that gets in the mix that we didn't foresee. So hopefully there isn't. Uh, but thank you very much for being with us again. And we're trying to set it up to talk again in 40 days and see how things are progressing. And thank you as always. It's great to have you here. And it's great to know you and talk with you.
Likewise, John, live long and prosper.
Yes, live long and prosper.